Imagine locking your right leg into like a heavy steel machine. You are strapped down, unable to move your hips or your torso, and you're told to push that right leg to absolute excruciating failure for nearly 2 straight minutes.
Right, which is just an eternity when you're under that much physical stress.
Oh, absolutely. It's a level of exertion that completely drains the muscle.
Yeah.
But here's the thing for you listening. Meanwhile, your left leg hasn't moved an inch. It is just resting there, completely fresh.
Yeah, doing absolutely nothing.
Exactly. But if you try to kick with that left leg, just say 60 seconds later, you will find it is suddenly, inexplicably, about 15% weaker.
Which makes no sense, right? Like mechanically, it makes no sense.
Right. It is basically this invisible biological blackout. The exhaustion from one side of your body has secretly hijacked the other side.
And, that really shatters the mechanical way we usually think about human anatomy. I mean, we tend to view the body as this collection of isolated pulleys and levers.
Like a machine with separate parts.
Exactly. You curl a dumbbell with your right arm, your right bicep gets tired, and, well, your left bicep remains perfectly fine. But when we look at the systemic physiology, we find a landscape that is deeply interconnected.
And the fatigue kind of bleeds over.
Yeah, the fatigue ripples across the entire system in ways that are highly predictable if you know what to look for, but almost magical if you don't.
Well, and today, we are finding out exactly how long it takes for the lights to come back on after that biological blackout. So for you listening, the mission of today's deep dive is to explore those systemic, invisible ripple effects of exhaustion within the human body.
It is a fascinating topic.
It really is. And we are pulling our insights from a rigorous, just incredibly revealing 2024 article. It's titled The Duration of Non-Local Muscle Fatigue Effects.
A really landmark piece of research.
Yeah, and we should credit the team behind it. This is authored by Zahiri, Reza Goudini, Shahab Alizadeh, Abdolhamid Daneshjoo, Mohamed Mahmoud, Andreas Konrad, Granacher, and David G. Behm.
Quite a roster of researchers.
Truly. And you can find this published in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine.
So this paper is so vital because it tackles a phenomenon sports scientists call non-local muscle fatigue, or they often abbreviate it as NLMF.
Or crossover fatigue, right?
Right. Crossover fatigue is the more casual term. And the basic premise is that fatiguing one specific muscle group induces a temporary performance decline in a completely different, unexercised muscle group.
Which, to be fair, we've known exists for a while.
Oh, absolutely. Massive meta-analyses by researchers like Halperin, Miller, and Behm have documented it extensively over the years.
But those older studies, I mean, they had a massive blind spot, which is what makes today's paper so interesting. Almost all of that previous research only measured the fresh, unexercised muscle immediately after the workout ended.
Right, exactly. They tested the resting leg the very second the person stopped sweating.
Yeah, so the data was incredibly muddy. I mean, some studies showed catastrophic strength drops, others showed tiny drops, and a weird handful even showed improvements. By only looking at the 0-minute mark, the scientific community was completely missing the actual timeline of recovery.
Yeah, it's like they were taking a single snapshot instead of recording the whole movie. The researchers behind today's paper realized that it's not just a binary question of if a fresh muscle gets tired.
We need to know the duration.
Exactly. How long does this invisible fatigue last before the central system resets itself? But, to understand that timeline, we first have to understand the underlying mechanics. We need to look at what is actually causing the drain.
Okay, let's unpack this before we get to the stopwatch.
Oh.
If I exhaust my right leg and my left leg gets noticeably weaker without doing any work, what is actually happening under the hood?
It's a great question.
Is the human body basically acting like a municipal power grid? Let's say there's a massive, unprecedented surge in electricity demand in one specific neighborhood, like the working muscle.
Right.
Does the central nervous system issue a mandatory temporary brownout in a completely different neighborhood, the resting muscle, just to keep the entire global system from crashing?
Right. That power grid analogy maps beautifully onto the physiological reality. When we examine the broader literature on crossover fatigue, we notice that the systemic brownout happens far more frequently when the lower limbs are doing the work.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, around 76% of the recorded instances of contralateral force deficits, which just means weakness crossing over to the opposite side, they occur during lower limb fatigue.
Because the legs are just bigger muscles.
Exactly. The legs are massive muscle groups. They draw significantly more power, so they cause a much larger systemic drain. And it happens mostly with repetitive, grueling, high-intensity contractions.
So the bigger the neighborhood, the bigger the blackout when it draws too much juice. But why does the grid fail in the first place? What are the actual biological mechanisms pulling the plug?
So historically, the scientific community proposed four main theories for this phenomenon. The first is neural motor overflow.
Okay, what does that mean?
The concept here is that your brain is trying so desperately to send high-voltage command signals to the agonizingly tired working leg that the neural pathways get, well, messy.
Like the wires are crossing.
Yeah, the electrical signals bleed over, which depletes your central nervous system's attentional capacity to fire up the resting leg later. The brain is simply too frazzled to send a clean signal to a new area.
Wow, so it's essentially signal interference. The wires are crossed and overheating. What's the second theory?
The second is biochemical. When you push a muscle to absolute failure, you are rapidly building up metabolic byproducts.
Like lactic acid.
Exactly. We are talking about lactic acid, hydrogen ions, extracellular potassium. The theory suggests that these metabolites don't just stay in the working muscle. They spill out into your central bloodstream, circulating everywhere.
And then they eventually wash over at the resting muscle.
Right, and chemically impair its ability to contract.
That paints a very different picture. Instead of an electrical failure, it's a chemical contamination of the supply lines. And the third theory?
And the third is biomechanical. And this one is highly practical. It suggests that your core stabilizer muscles, your abdominals, your lower back, they get completely exhausted just trying to keep your torso upright and rigid during a massive physical effort.
Oh, sure.
So when you try to use your fresh limb a moment later, your core is essentially shot. Your entire physical foundation is wobbly, meaning you can't brace effectively to push maximum force.
That makes total sense intuitively. Like if my foundation is built on Jell-O, I can't fire a cannon from it no matter how good the cannon is.
Exactly. Great analogy. And the fourth theory moves away from the muscles entirely and looks at psychology. It is the perception of effort.
The perception of effort. Okay.
Yeah, this theory argues that the sheer mental agony of pushing one muscle to its absolute physiological limit drains your global mental energy. Your brain experiences a profound psychological trauma from the discomfort.
So it just wants to stop.
Right. It subconsciously decides, that was awful. I am not doing anything that hard again anytime soon. And it artificially limits your physical output on the subsequent task as a protective mechanism.
Wow, so the muscle tissue is fine, but the brain refuses to authorize the effort.
Precisely.
So we have an electrical theory, a chemical theory, a structural theory, and a psychological theory. To figure out which of these is actually driving the blackout and exactly how long it lasts, the researchers needed to design a test that would completely isolate these variables.
They did.
They needed to induce a massive localized power drain and then measure the exact minute the lights came back on in the rest of the body.
And the protocol they designed to do exactly that was, well, it was brilliant in its cruelty.
Cruelty is a good word for it.
Yeah, they recruited 17 recreationally trained participants, 13 male and 4 female, for a randomized crossover study. The fatigue intervention they use is known as an MVIC, which is a maximal voluntary isometric contraction.
Okay, MVIC.
They had the participants perform 2 sets of 100-second MVICs on their dominant knee extensors, the quadriceps, with only 1 minute of rest between the sets.
For you listening, we really need to pause and truly conceptualize the physical demand of a 100-second MVIC. This is not doing a heavy set of squats for a minute and a half.
No, not at all.
This is sitting in a chair, having your ankle chained to an immovable steel bar, and trying to kick your leg out with 100% absolute maximum force continuously without a single second of relief for 1 minute and 40 seconds.
It induces a state of sheer, unadulterated physiological agony. I mean, when a muscle is contracted at absolute maximum force for that long, it physically squeezes its own blood vessels shut.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you are causing localized ischemia. No fresh oxygen is getting in, and no metabolic waste is getting out. The burn is astronomical. It is arguably the most efficient way to completely and utterly drain a specific muscle group.
And the researchers controlled the physical environment strictly, right? To eliminate that third theory we discussed, the biomechanical stabilizer theory. If the core muscles are the problem, take the core out of the equation.
They absolutely immobilized them. Participants were strapped into a specialized, heavily padded chair. They wore a rigid 5-point harness securing their waist and shoulders.
Like a race car seat.
Exactly. Their arms had to be crossed tightly over their chests. Their hips and knees were locked at strict 90-degree angles. They couldn't squirm. They couldn't recruit their lower back. They couldn't cheat.
Total isolation. And while the dominant leg was going through this isometric torture, the researchers had surface electromyography EMG electrodes attached to the non-dominant, completely resting leg.
Right, to see what was happening electrically.
Yeah, they placed these sensors on the vastus lateralis, which is the outer sweep of the quad, and the biceps femoris, the hamstring on the back of the leg.
And they were meticulous about the data quality. They shaved the skin on the resting leg, lightly abraded it with sandpaper to remove dead skin cells, and cleaned it with alcohol swabs to ensure the electrical signal from the muscle was flawless.
They weren't messing around.
No, and during the fatigue protocol, they actively monitored that resting leg to ensure its electrical activity stayed below 5% of its maximum. It had to remain perfectly, completely relaxed while the other side of the body was fighting a war.
So the dominant leg is destroyed. The non-dominant leg just chills. Then comes the telemetry. The researchers unchained the dominant leg and immediately measured the maximum strength of that perfectly fresh, unexercised non-dominant leg at exactly 1 minute, 3 minutes, and 5 minutes post-workout using highly sensitive strain gauges.
And they didn't just measure the absolute peak force, like how much total pressure you can push. They measured something called F100, or instantaneous strength.
Instantaneous strength, okay.
Right, F100 is a vital metric that often gets overlooked in basic strength studies. It measures the absolute amount of force the muscle can produce in the very first 100 milliseconds of the contraction. It is a direct measurement of the rate of force development.
Which, in the real world outside the lab, is arguably the most important type of strength you have. I mean, peak force is what you use when you slowly leverage a heavy couch off the floor. But instantaneous strength is what saves your life when you trip on a curb and have to snap your leg out in a fraction of a second to catch yourself.
Absolutely. It's the explosive power a sprinter uses the millisecond the starting gun fires. It's a pure test of how fast your nervous system can dump electricity into the muscle fibers.
Because it's all about speed.
Yeah, it relies heavily on the initial discharge rate of the motor units. If your central nervous system is fatigued, your F100 drops dramatically because the brain simply cannot recruit the muscle fibers fast enough. It is the ultimate proxy for neural drive.
Okay, so we have the torture protocol established, and we have the recording equipment calibrated. Let's look at the actual telemetry coming back from that unexercised leg at those critical time markers. What actually happens to a supposedly fresh quadricep when the opposite side of the body is totally fried?
Well, the hard data reveals a very strict, undeniable biological timer. When they tested that resting, non-dominant quadricep for peak force at the 1-minute mark, there was a moderate, statistically significant 15.8% drop in maximum strength.
A nearly 16% loss of power in a muscle that literally did nothing but sit there.
Right. It's a massive systemic tax. Then, moving to the 3-minute mark, that deficit shrank to an 8.5% drop.
So it's recovering.
The muscle is still significantly weaker than its baseline, but yeah, the system is clearly recovering. Finally, at the 5-minute mark, the deficit vanished entirely. The data actually showed a non-significant 8.9% increase, meaning it returned to baseline and perhaps even benefited slightly from being warmed up by the central nervous system.
Wow, the 3-minute blackout.
And that F100 metric, the instantaneous explosive strength, followed the exact same trajectory. There were large, significant reductions in explosive power at the 1-minute and 3-minute marks, and then a complete normalization by minute 5.
But the physical force output is only half the story. The researchers were also measuring the EMG, the raw electrical signal traveling from the brain down the spinal cord to that resting muscle. And here's where it gets really interesting. The data here presents a massive counterintuitive contradiction.
Oh, it really does.
Because we just established the unexercised leg was physically weaker at the 1-minute mark, losing nearly 16% of its force. But the electrical signal, the EMG data, actually increased significantly at that exact same 1-minute mark.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that this specific finding completely upends the neural motor overflow theory we discussed earlier.
Because if the brain was too tired,
Right, if the power grid was just browning out neurologically, if the brain was too fried to send a strong signal to the fresh leg, we would absolutely expect the EMG electrical reading to drop alongside the physical force. The brain would be whispering instead of shouting.
wait, I have to push back on the implications of this. If the force drops, but the electrical signal spikes, That means the brain is screaming at the muscle to fire. The muscle is receiving a massive high-voltage command. But something else is physically preventing that muscle from doing its job.
Yes, we can visualize this mechanically. Think of your individual muscle fibers like rows of tiny oarsmen rowing a boat.
Okay, I like that.
Under normal circumstances, the brain yells, "Row!" That's the electrical EMG signal, and the oarsmen pull their oars cleanly through the water, generating force. But in this scenario, the brain is yelling louder than ever, the signal is crystal clear, but the boat isn't moving as fast.
So something is wrong with the water.
Exactly, something is wrong with the water.
So the neuromuscular junction, the place where the nerve tells the muscle to contract, that's working perfectly. The brain is hitting the gas pedal all the way to the floor, but the transmission is slipping. The mechanical output is failing.
The electrical command cannot overcome the physical blockade at the cellular level. So if the electrical signal from the nervous system isn't the culprit, we have to look deeper into the tissue itself. And to do that, we have to ask, does this invisible fatigue infect the entire leg, or does the body selectively target specific areas?
Which brings us to the data collected on the back of the leg, the hamstring.
Right.
Because they were measuring the biceps femoris at the exact same 1, 3, and 5-minute intervals. If this is a global biological blackout, the whole leg should go dark.
Right. You would think so. But the data for the non-dominant hamstrings, the knee flexors, was a complete mystery compared to the highly predictable quadriceps.
Really? What do they find?
Unlike the quads, the hamstrings showed no predictable pattern whatsoever. Peak force showed no significant changes across any of the recovery times. The instantaneous F100 strength had huge deficits at 3 minutes, but strangely not at 1 minute.
That is bizarre.
And the EMG data showed large deficits at 1 minute, massive spikes at 3 minutes. It was completely chaotic telemetry.
So we've proven the brain is sending the signal, but the opposing quad muscle is ignoring it, while the hamstring on the same leg doesn't seem to care either way. Why does this chemical blackout infect the exact mirror image muscle but spare the hamstring sitting right next to it?
It comes down to vascular routing and the principle of movement specificity. The fatigue intervention was exclusively knee extension, so just the quadriceps.
Right.
Fatiguing the quads on one side does not predictably or universally fatigue the antagonist muscles, the hamstrings, on the other side. When the brain orchestrates a specific movement pattern, it directs blood flow and physiological resources to those specific neural pathways and tissues.
So it's very targeted.
Yes, the body is highly specific about where it applies this crossover fatigue, likely because the vascular network is dumping the metabolic waste most heavily into the identical tissues that demand it on the other side.
Okay, let's untangle the two surviving theories based on this new evidence. We know the nervous system's electrical signal isn't the main problem because the signal spiked.
Correct.
And we know the biomechanical core stabilizer theory was eliminated by strapping them to a chair.
Also correct.
So we are left with the biochemical soup and the psychological trauma. Explain the biochemical blockade.
So even though the resting quad did absolutely no physical work, the dominant quad produced massive amounts of metabolic byproducts during those 100-second isometric holds.
Oh, that lactic acid.
Right. And the localized ischemia meant those metabolites couldn't escape during the hold. But the second the participant relaxed at the 100-second mark, blood rushed in, picked up all those hydrogen ions, lactate and potassium, and flushed them into the central cardiovascular system.
Oh, wow. So the exhaust from the working engine gets forcibly pumped into the intake of the perfectly resting engine.
Exactly. Going back to our analogy, those metabolites are like pouring thick, heavy mud into the water where our oarsmen are trying to row.
Oh, I see.
The brain sends the electrical signal, but the muscle fibers, the actin and myosin filaments, are sitting in a highly acidic, chemically altered soup that physically prevents them from fully locking together and generating mechanical force.
The oarsmen physically cannot pull through the sludge.
They just can't. And the data shows it takes the liver and the cardiovascular system roughly 5 minutes to filter that blood and clear the sludge out of the resting tissue.
That explains the strict timeline beautifully. The 3-minute blackout is just the time it takes the body's filtration system to do its job. But you mentioned the psychological factor is still a highly viable piece of this puzzle. How does the perception of effort physically stop you from pushing?
Well, we have to look at the modern scientific definition of effort. Effort is the brain constantly, subconsciously comparing the physiological demands of a task to its perceived capacity to handle that task.
Okay.
When you put a participant through 200 total seconds of excruciating maximum intensity isometric hold, you create a massive global mental energy deficit.
It's a form of financial trauma, really. Like if you just spent your last $100 on an emergency car repair, and 5 minutes later a friend asks you for $10 for a coffee, you instinctively say no.
Wow.
Not because you don't physically have the $10, but because your entire system is so panicked from the massive sudden expenditure that it goes into absolute conservation mode. You hoard your remaining resources.
That is a perfect way to put it. The central nervous system operates on the exact same logic. The brain registers the extreme discomfort of the first task. So when you immediately ask them to kick as hard as they can with the fresh leg at the 1-minute mark, the brain's global perception of effort is totally skewed.
It feels harder than it should.
Way harder. The new task feels impossibly, disproportionately hard because the central nervous system is still reeling from the agony of the first task. The brain limits the capacity to exert maximum effort because it refuses to authorize another massive withdrawal from the central bank, even if the local muscle tissue is perfectly capable.
And just like the chemical clearance, that heightened psychological panic takes a few minutes to dissipate.
Exactly right.
So what does this all mean for you listening? How do you actually apply this biological 3-minute blackout to your own life? Whether you are mapping out your gym routine, playing a sport, or doing heavy physical labor, the application here is incredibly practical.
It really is.
If you heavily fatigue one side of your body or one specific muscle group, you cannot immediately switch to the other side and expect 100% peak performance.
No, you cannot just superset left leg, right leg with 30 seconds of rest and expect peak force or maximum explosive power on the second leg.
You are operating at a 15% deficit before you even start. If you want true peak capacity from the fresh side, especially that instantaneous, explosive F100 strength that relies on rapid neural drive, you need to respect the biological timer.
Give your central system a full 5 minutes to clear the chemical mud from the water and reset the psychological panic of effort.
But there are some limitations to this study, right?
Yes, that is the direct practical application, but we must view these findings through the lens of the study's specific academic limitations. The study utilized 17 participants who were only recreationally trained. They participated in general physical activities perhaps 1 to 3 times a week.
Why does that matter? I mean, a muscle is a muscle, right?
Well, not when it comes to the central nervous system. The authors point out a critical nuance. True maximum exertion is a learned neurological skill.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because these participants were not elite competitive lifters, they likely did not possess the highly tuned neurological ability to push themselves to their absolute true physiological maximums over those grueling 100-second intervals.
Oh, because most people subconsciously give up when the pain spikes.
Exactly, but a professional athlete knows how to bypass that pain response and recruit every single available motor unit.
So a pro athlete can drain the battery far deeper than a regular person.
They can. And the paradox here is fascinating. If the recreational athletes weren't hitting true absolute failure, they might not have induced the maximum possible chemical spill or the maximum psychological trauma.
Wait, so for an elite athlete?
The authors hypothesized that if this exact protocol were performed by highly trained professional athletes, the perception of effort deficit might actually be significantly more severe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the crossover fatigue could be far more pronounced, and the biological blackout might last even longer precisely because the elite athlete is capable of drawing so much more power from the grid in the first place.
The better you are at training, the worse your systemic brownout might be. It really shows how much more research is needed to see how this scales with elite populations, and also with larger, more balanced male and female cohorts to explore potential sex differences in how we clear those metabolites or process the psychological perception of effort.
Absolutely. And to view the complete data set, examine the chaotic hamstring telemetry and see the exact charts of that 5-minute recovery window, we highly encourage you to read the full article by Zahiri et al. In the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine. It fundamentally changes how we view recovery between sets.
It makes you wonder about the further implications of this connected grid. I mean, if profound physical fatigue chemically and psychologically crosses over to unrelated muscles, what happens with cognitive fatigue?
That's a great point.
If you spend 2 hours doing agonizing high-level math problems or navigating a highly stressful meeting, does a completely unrelated physical muscle group suffer a 15% biological blackout just because your brain's central effort bank is completely drained?
It's very possible.
The biological grid connecting our brain, our blood, and our muscles might be vastly more intertwined than we ever thought. As always, make sure to follow the channel and turn on your notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the science of how we work. Until next time, remember, the system is always connected. Keep your power balanced.